In the winter of 1841, Hartford society thrived on appearance. Every handshake, every invitation, every union whispered of status and security. But beneath the calm veneer of polished silver and starched linen, ambition festered. Love, when misaligned with bloodlines and inheritance, became combustible. In December of that year, at the heart of the city's most esteemed parish, a wedding was meant to bind two respected families. Instead, it shattered them, exposing what envy, prejudice, and maternal pride could conceal in plain sight. The chalice meant to bless a sacred union carried not wine but death. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. What unfolded in Hartford that winter is at once tragic, fascinating, and chillingly human. This is not a ghost story, nor an unsolved mystery whispered through tavern doors. It is instead a matter of record, a case as public as it was private, where the heart of a family turned against itself under the weight of class expectation and fear of social dissent. At its center were four figures: a mother of social distinction, born into wealth and sharpened by years of quiet competition in parlors and drawing rooms; a son, promising, earnest, who had inherited his father's name and his mother's pride; a bride, chosen not for her connections, but for her character, and therefore to certain eyes, wholly unsuitable; a city, watching with curiosity, then horror, as one household's ambitions bled into criminality. To understand what happened, we must step briefly into Hartford as it stood in 1841. The railroads were coming, steam-driven, and with them, a shifting economy. Irish immigrants, Catholic, ambitious, often poor, arrived in growing numbers, unsettling families who traced their roots to the earliest colonial stock. Marriage, once a personal matter, had become a subtle transaction between social worlds: who gained, who diminished, who whispered afterward. The Petron family, as they will be known here, stood at a delicate edge of that world. Jonathan Petron, the patriarch, had secured their standing decades prior through law and property, but his passing left his widow, Eleanor, to maintain that position alone. And Eleanor was nothing if not meticulous. She curated her son William's education, friendships, and prospects as carefully as a gardener pruning a prized orchard. Then came Bridget O'Callaghan, auburn-haired, intelligent, unflinching in her gaze. An immigrant's daughter, educated by nuns, practical yet refined in a way that did not lean on pedigree. She and William met not in drawing rooms, but in the shadowed quiet of Hartford's expanding public library, where conversation blossomed in whispers among stacks of law volumes and borrowed novels. By the autumn of 1841, their engagement was the subject of both curiosity and concern. Some saw romance, a joining of heart over heritage. Others saw decline, a young man with a venerable name, choosing affection over advantage. Eleanor Petron saw threat. It began as so many tragedies do, in silence. Friends noticed her absence from teas where she had once presided with elegance. Servants reported longer hours in her private rooms, letters written late into the night. William, earnest and dutiful, dismissed her withdrawal as a widow's melancholy at the prospect of a changed household. Bridget, gracious to a fault, took it as maternal reserve, hoping to win approval through patience. The wedding date was set for December 18th, a Saturday chosen for its convenience to distant relatives. Trinity Church prepared for a modest but elegant ceremony, poinsettias at the altar, silver chalices polished, music rehearsed. Father Matthews, a priest known for his steady sermons and careful adherence to tradition, oversaw preparations with customary dignity. Hartford society, ever hungry for spectacle cloaked in sanctity, turned its eyes toward Trinity that morning. The pews filled with silk and wool, with whispers and glances. Here was a union of old name and new stock, of fortune balanced against affection, a story to be told in parlors for weeks to come. The ceremony began without incident. The procession moved with solemn grace. Vows were spoken, hands joined, rings exchanged. And then, as custom dictated, came communion, a symbolic binding of souls before God and witnesses. The chalice, ornate and heavy, gleamed beneath the church's winter light. The wine within, deep red, seemed no different from 100 other services before it, but as the bride raised it to her lips, her hands trembled, not from nerves, from a sudden searing constriction in her throat, a metallic bitterness blooming on her tongue, followed by pain, sharp, rising, merciless. The church, that place of solemn witness, became in an instant a theater of chaos. Guests stood, startled, then rushed forward as Bridget fell, her complexion draining to the pallor of parchment. William caught her before she struck the ground, his voice breaking against the vaulted ceiling as calls for a physician rang out. Father Matthews halted the ceremony, his voice low and urgent, commanding the chalice removed, the doors barred. The sacred had been profaned, deliberately. In the hours that followed, suspicion coiled like smoke. Bridget's collapse was no fainting spell, no sudden fever.
Her symptoms, the retching, the burning, the rapid weakening, bore a pattern that any practiced physician could not mistake. Dr. Harrison, summoned from nearby, worked furiously with emetics and neutralizing agents, his hands steady, his jaw set tight against the murmured prayers and frightened sobs echoing in the rectory. Within 2 hours, Bridget clung to life, hovering between agony and exhaustion, while the church's leaders convened in hushed tones over what was increasingly obvious. The chalice, that vessel of blessing, had been poisoned, and not by accident. By evening, as the winter sun fell and the gas lamps flickered across Hartford's cobbled streets, the city's most prominent families whispered the unthinkable. This was no misfortune of chance. Someone trusted, someone with access, had intended to end a life at the altar. The police were notified. The chalice, sealed and sent under guard, would soon reveal traces unmistakable in their intent. A wedding day had become an attempted murder, and behind it stood motives older than the vows spoken that morning. Pride, prejudice, and a mother's ambition sharpened into something lethal. Early discovery. By dawn the next day, the parlor of the Petron house had become less a sitting room than a place of inquiry. The lamps burned low, coffee turned cold in untouched cups, and the weight of a crime newly born hung in the air like an invisible storm. The marriage had been sanctified in the eyes of church and law, but the city had woken to a scandal so grotesque that neither sacrament nor ceremony could shield it from judgment. Bridget O'Callaghan, pale but conscious, lay in a quiet room above Dr. Harrison's office. He had watched her all night, counting pulse against time, matching every convulsion with a measured, clinical calm. "She has been poisoned," he told Father Matthews with a bluntness that allowed no refuge in denial. "Not by spoiled wine, nor by accidental contamination. This is arsenic, and it was delivered deliberately." The chalice itself told a grim tale. The residue lining its silver bowl was subtle, just a faint haze that might have escaped a hurried eye, but in the light of a chemist's reagents, it betrayed its nature immediately. The wine had been tainted with care, measured precisely to ensure lethal effect without betraying itself by taste or smell. It was in every way an act planned with forethought. The Hartford constables began their inquiry quietly at first, visiting Trinity in the early hours, questioning sacristans, sextons, anyone who had touched the ceremonial items. Father Matthews provided a detailed account of preparations. The chalice, he insisted, had been filled no more than an hour before the wedding, the wine drawn from a fresh bottle kept locked in the vestry. He himself had placed it on the altar. "It was under my sight until the procession began," he said, his voice heavy with a priest's guilt, as if he had failed not just a bride but God himself. But the vestry door had not been guarded. In the press of guests, the shifting of people between pews, the casual movements of servants and relatives, opportunity had opened like a wound. Someone, in those unnoticed minutes, had reached into the sacred and corrupted it. Whispers, once cautious, began to gather names. The servant spoke, reluctantly at first, of strained glances between Eleanor Petron and her future daughter-in-law. "Madam never raised her voice," said one maid, wringing her hands as she spoke to a constable, but she looked at Miss O'Callaghan as if she were a stain upon the linen. Not unkind exactly, but cold like a winter pond. A neighbor recalled Eleanor's sharp comment at a tea weeks earlier, dismissed at the time as nothing but society's nervous chatter. She said Hartford must be careful not to lose itself. The neighbor recounted that blood diluted by ambition was blood diminished. "I thought she spoke in abstractions. Now I wonder." And there was William, pale, exhausted, pulled now between two loyalties that no man ought ever to have to weigh. He sat beside Bridget for hours, holding her hand, his own eyes hollow with disbelief. When pressed by constables, he denied any suspicion at first. "My mother is a woman of integrity," he said, his voice low. "She is proud, yes, particular, yes, but capable of this? No. You insult her, and you insult me." But even as he spoke, the facts crept like frost across a window pane. Access, motive, means. There were no strangers in that vestry, no wandering hands without purpose. Whoever had poisoned the chalice had known the timing, known the custom, known that the bride would drink first, sealing not just a sacrament but a death sentence. By the afternoon, Hartford hummed with a sickened fascination. Shops along Main Street leaned into whispered speculation. Was it money? Was it reputation? Had William's inheritance been threatened by this union? Each tale, more lurid than the last, grew from the same seed, that the crime had come from within, not from some nameless intruder, but from the very heart of the family. Dr. Harrison, summoned again to testify before the magistrate, was clinical but grim. The poison was deliberate, he said, presenting a small vial of clear crystals he had separated from the chalice residue. Arsenic, refined and pure, sufficient in quantity to kill an adult within an hour. Were it not for immediate intervention, the bride would have expired before nightfall. Whoever prepared this did so with understanding of both dosage and delivery. The magistrate frowned, his quill scratching notes that would soon become warrants.
"And can you estimate when it was introduced into the wine?" he asked. "Within an hour of ingestion," Harrison replied. "Earlier, and the solution would have separated, leaving sediment visible to the naked eye. Whoever did this prepared it freshly, likely with gloves or a cloth, and did so with steady hands. A timeline began to take shape, careful, sober, undeniable. Between the filling of the chalice and its presentation at the altar, perhaps 20 minutes passed. In those 20 minutes, Eleanor Petron was observed entering the vestry, alone, to retrieve a lace handkerchief she claimed to have forgotten in the pew. A gesture so small, so unremarkable, that no one had thought to question it, until now. By evening, constables called at the Petron home. Eleanor received them with a calm that unsettled even hardened men of the law. She neither protested nor wept. "If you believe I have wronged anyone," she said, "you must do what the law requires. I will not impede you." She was escorted to the city jail that night, not in irons but under quiet guard, her head held high, her expression unreadable. Hartford, a city accustomed to gossip as entertainment, now found itself silenced by the gravity of what had unfolded. A woman of rank, accused not of theft nor fraud, but of poisoning her own son's bride at the altar of God. William did not sleep. Bridget drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fragile but her mind sharpening against the weight of betrayal. She asked for no vengeance, only truth. "Tell me," she whispered to William in the hours before dawn. Was it hate that moved her, or fear? He had no answer. The investigation moved swiftly. The church locked away all ceremonial items. Father Matthews prepared affidavits. Dr. Harrison prepared his samples for court. Hartford, in those days, was a city both modern and old, quick to prosecute, but bound by a sense of propriety that demanded cases be proven beyond all speculation. Within 48 hours, a formal charge was filed, attempted murder by poisoning. Bail was denied. The trial was scheduled within the month, promising to be the most public reckoning Hartford had seen in decades. But even before the first arguments were spoken, the case had already become something larger than a single crime. It became a mirror held up to society itself, how easily love and prejudice could entwine, how the private resentments of parlors could erupt into acts so cold, so calculated, that even God's house could not shield the innocent. And in parlors and taverns alike, people began to speak not only of Eleanor Petron, but of the city's own complicity, of whispered biases, of unspoken hierarchies, of the quiet cruelty that sat behind every polite smile. For in Eleanor's alleged act, Hartford saw not merely one woman's sin, but a reflection of what it had allowed itself to believe, that some lives by birth alone were worth more than others, and that perhaps was the most frightening revelation of all. Family secrets surface. The weeks that followed felt as though time itself had taken ill. The days did not pass so much as they lurched forward, sluggish and heavy, with each hour steeped in rumor and anticipation. Hartford had never seen a case like this. It was neither a street crime nor a political scandal. It was domestic, brutal in its intimacy, and it had unfurled in public view under the vaulted ceiling of Trinity Church. The Petron family had been, until then, untouchable. They were merchants of distinction, their name affixed to shipping ledgers, fine textiles, and 2 properties on Prospect Street that stood like quiet monuments to generational wealth. But now the curtains were drawn, the servants hushed, and the patriarch, Thomas Petron, was a man unmoored. He appeared in court twice, not yet as a witness but merely to ensure the decency of proceedings. Observers noted the pallor of his face, the way his hands trembled not with age but with some inner fissure, some fracture between loyalty and law. William himself was kept under informal guard, not accused but scrutinized. He was, after all, the hinge between victim and alleged perpetrator. To many he appeared broken, yet his composure suggested a man caught between filial duty and marital devotion, between blood and vow. He spoke little, save to comfort Bridget, whose recovery was slow but visible. Her body bore the quiet indignities of poison, the brittleness of hair, the weakness in limbs, but her eyes sharpened. They carried no hysteria, only a steady demand for truth. The magistrate, a certain Jonathan Hale, had begun requesting documents, marriage settlements, wills, property transfers, all those brittle papers upon which family power quietly rests. It was here, not in the vestry, not in the chalice, that the true rot began to show. Hale discovered that the union of William and Bridget did more than offend sensibilities, it shifted inheritance. By marrying Bridget, William had circumvented a clause in Thomas Petron's will that, curiously, Eleanor had drafted alongside the family solicitor some years prior. The clause ensured that should William marry a woman outside certain circles of esteem, the wording as vague as it was vicious, his inheritance would be halved, the remainder dispersed among charitable trusts over which Eleanor retained lifetime influence. In effect, she had tethered her son's future not to merit, but to her own measure of worth.
but Thomas had, without public notice, amended the will 2 months prior to the wedding. Perhaps he did so in secret sympathy, perhaps in resignation to his son's unwavering choice. The new language restored William's full inheritance regardless of match. The solicitor's own notes revealed a meeting late in the spring, at which Thomas, described as weary, yet keen in thought, had declared that love, not lineage, should determine the family's next generation. If Eleanor knew of this amendment, she never acknowledged it. But correspondence uncovered in a locked escritoire suggested suspicion at the very least. A letter, unsigned but unmistakably hers, written to a cousin in New Haven. "They will ruin us under the guise of affection. I have urged correction, but Thomas deathers, and William is bewitched. I will not stand idle while we are diminished, not in standing, not in blood." The prosecution seized on the letter immediately, presenting it not yet in court but to the press, who reproduced its phrases in lurid headlines. "Not in blood," blared one paper, as though the words themselves carried arsenic enough to poison the city's calm.
But there were quieter discoveries too, ones that never made the headlines but which deepened the wound. In Eleanor's personal effects, constables found a small apothecary's jar, its label removed but its contents familiar to anyone with chemical training. White arsenic, used in Hartford most commonly as rat poison. Such substances were legal, purchasable even by housewives, their danger lying less in access than in intent. Yet in Eleanor's case, intent now loomed like a shadow no witness could disperse. The defense, when it assembled, leaned not on denial but on distortion. Eleanor's counsel suggested contamination, perhaps by a careless servant. They suggested in muted tones that Bridget herself might have suffered from some hidden illness, that her convulsions were coincidental, her weakness a prior malady misread. But these claims dissolved under Harrison's precise testimony, under the timeline of access, under the physical evidence recovered not from theory but from Eleanor's own home. What truly chilled the city, however, were the whispered conversations about the Petron family's history, details that until now had been quietly tucked beneath the polish of wealth. There were rumors of Eleanor's father, a man who had overseen a factory where safety was an afterthought, who had paid bribes to bury deaths caused by faulty boilers. There was talk of an uncle institutionalized for melancholia, whose confinement was less for illness than for fear of scandal. And there were, too, suggestions, never fully substantiated, that Eleanor's marriage to Thomas had been less a union of affection than of convenience, a strategic alignment of capital that had, over time, calcified into cold hierarchy. All of it now converged in one unbearable tableau, a mother-in-law, once the silent architect of her family's social architecture, now cast as its executioner. Hartford, a city priding itself on refinement, now confronted the barbarity hidden behind its own parlors. Bridget herself began to speak, not to the press but to the priest. Her statements, recorded carefully, revealed no bitterness, only clarity. "I never believed she wished me harm," she said softly from her convalescent bed, "but I knew I was unwelcome. I thought it would fade. I thought time would soften her. But there are some stones, Father, that weather does not touch." William sat beside her as these words were spoken, his silence a kind of grief that could not yet choose its object. Did he mourn his mother, who sat alone in a cell of stone? Did he mourn the trust that had been shattered like glass dropped in a quiet room? Or did he mourn the man he had been, a son, a husband, a bridge between two worlds now burned? As the trial drew near, Hartford prepared not only for a legal reckoning, but for a moral one. Sermons shifted from parables to warnings. Shopkeepers spoke of poisoned goods with a new caution. Households began to lock away medicines once left casually on kitchen shelves, and in drawing rooms across the city, people stared at one another with a question they could not ask aloud. If this could happen in the Petron family, what might be festering in ours? The answer, of course, was unknowable. That was the true horror. For while arsenic could be tested, traced and weighed, malice could not. It moved invisibly, through expectation, pride, resentment, all those quiet shadows of the heart that no court could fully expose. And so Hartford waited. The courthouse would soon open its tall doors to a city hungry not merely for justice but for understanding, an understanding that would not come easily, and perhaps would not come at all. The courtroom unveils the truth. The courthouse smelled of beeswax and cold stone that morning, as though cleanliness might quiet the dread pressing against its walls. Citizens had begun queuing before sunrise, not out of morbid curiosity alone, but because they sensed correctly that what would unfold within would touch the city beyond the crime itself.
This was not merely a trial of a woman, it was a trial of Hartford's own values, blood against merit, prejudice against law. Eleanor Petron was led in without chains. She wore a gown of deep grey wool, fitted but modest, her hair drawn back without ornament. She looked neither defiant nor ashamed, but composed a composure that chilled the gallery far more than any outburst could have done. She did not glance at Bridget, nor at William, who sat stiffly at the front, pale as parchment, his jaw locked. The presiding judge, Charles Huntington, began not with ceremony but with an admonition. This court will not serve gossip, it will serve evidence. The city hushed. Even the scrape of a boot on tile sounded intrusive. The prosecution wasted no time. Dr. Harrison was called first, his steady hands now bearing papers rather than remedies. His testimony was precise, clinical, even reluctant. Traces of arsenic were found in the chalice residue, he confirmed. The quantity was consistent with intentional administration, not accidental contamination. His words landed without embellishment, but their weight was undeniable. The defense tried to claw at the margins. Perhaps the chalice had been mishandled. Perhaps the sacristy had been breached. Perhaps someone seeking mischief had added poison in ignorance of its effect. But Harrison dismantled each theory with calm authority. The arsenic was pure. The chalice had been in Eleanor's possession for over an hour before the ceremony. The sacristy had been secured, and no other vessel showed contamination. Then came the letters. The unsigned correspondence found in her escritoire, heavy with intent though light in explicit threat, was read aloud. The words "not in blood" echoed through the courtroom like a confession disguised as pride. Eleanor's counsel objected, circumstantial, interpretive, but the judge allowed it, noting that while motive alone cannot convict, it may illuminate the shadow into which fact must step. Witnesses followed. Servants testified to Eleanor's agitation in the weeks before the wedding, her whispered arguments with Thomas, her sudden dismissal of a maid who had expressed delight at Bridget's gentleness. A chemist recalled a transaction 3 months prior. Arsenic purchased under the polite fiction of pest control, signed not by Eleanor, but by a family agent, yet linked by payment drawn from her own account. But the pivot, the breath-stealing moment that hardened speculation into tragedy, came when Bridget herself took the stand. She walked carefully, not out of weakness now, but out of the solemnity that clung to her like a veil. She did not weep, she did not falter. She told the court of her wedding morning, of Eleanor's cold civility, of the chalice passed to her lips, of the burning metallic bitterness that had bloomed beneath the sweet sacramental wine. She described the convulsions, the blackening edges of her sight, the voice of her husband breaking in terror as Father Matthews cried for a physician. She spoke of her survival with a composure that drew the gallery into a silence so complete it bordered on reverence. "I bear no hatred toward Mrs. Petron," she said, her voice low but clear. "I believe she acted from love for her son, love twisted by fear and pride. But I cannot forget that she chose poison over prayer, death over humility, simply because she believed my blood unworthy of hers." A ripple moved through the crowd, not outrage alone, but something more brittle, recognition. For all their whispering about Eleanor's cruelty, many in that room had in quieter ways shared her prejudice. The mirror she had held up to Hartford was warped by crime, yet it reflected nonetheless. William's testimony followed, and it gutted the room. He did not defend his mother, nor did he condemn her with venom. He spoke instead of the values she herself had taught him: honor, integrity, moral courage. "Those same values," he said, his voice raw yet steady, "now require that I speak truthfully, however it wounds the heart." He recounted the subtle warnings he had ignored, the simmering tension in his home, the unspoken plea in his father's eyes the night before the wedding, a plea he now understood as knowledge withheld out of shame. And then quietly, he confirmed what the documents already suggested, that Thomas's final amendment to the family will had rendered Bridget's bloodline irrelevant to inheritance. The poisoning, then, had been not only monstrous but useless. A blade swung long after the duel was over. The jury, 12 men drawn from merchants, tradesmen and clerks, deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned with a verdict as heavy as it was inevitable: guilty of attempted murder. Judge Huntington delivered the sentence with solemn gravity: 15 years in the Connecticut State Prison. Consideration had been given to Eleanor's social position and her previously unblemished record. But as the judge intoned, when ambition, pride, and prejudice take human form and wield themselves against innocent life, the law must answer with severity equal to the harm intended. Eleanor did not cry. She did not speak. She merely lowered her head as the clerk read the formal words of condemnation. Yet as she was led away, an observer near the aisle swore they saw her lips move, not in prayer, nor in regret, but in a whisper of some private defiance, a thought too bitter to be voiced aloud. Thomas Petron never returned to court. He withdrew from public life entirely, citing ill health, though some said it was shame that hollowed him. William and Bridget, now publicly vindicated yet privately scarred, left Hartford within the month, settling in Boston where the name Petron carried less echo. There, William built a modest law practice, and Bridget, with quiet tenacity, poured her efforts into charitable work for Irish immigrants, using in a kind of poetic inversion the very social skills once wielded against her. Hartford itself changed, if only in part. The case had forced polite society to look at itself, to admit that its hierarchies, drawn not by character but by lineage, were porous, dangerous even. Sermons began to speak less of providence and more of justice. Charity boards began, cautiously, to include immigrant women. And in Trinity Church, Father Matthews instituted a policy that no ceremonial object would ever again leave clerical supervision, no matter how esteemed the family requesting it. But the private damage lingered. There were those who would never forgive Bridget for surviving, as though her endurance had exposed not only a crime, but a hypocrisy too deep to confront. There were those who avoided William, their discomfort not rooted in judgment but in fear of being reminded how fragile family loyalty becomes when truth demands betrayal. As for Eleanor, she served 12 of her 15 years, released for good behavior into a world that had long since moved on from her scandal. She returned to Hartford a ghost among the living, her fortune eroded, her pride bent, her name spoken only in cautionary tones. She lived quietly in a boarding house, her days reduced to sewing, reading, and the occasional solitary walk through streets that had once bent to her greeting. In the end, her crime had accomplished none of what she intended. The marriage had endured, the lineage she feared had flourished, and the prejudice that had driven her to poison had, in a cruel reversal, weakened the very social barriers she once fought to preserve. The poisoned chalice, once a vessel of horror, was melted down, its silver donated to a fund supporting the very people Eleanor had despised. There is a symmetry in history that sometimes feels like divine arithmetic, but among the city's archives, the name Eleanor Petron still draws a quiet shiver. Not because of what she did alone, but because of what it revealed, that under the drapery of civility, even in a city proud of its refinement, fear and pride can curdle into violence, and love, left untempered by humility, can devour the very lives it claims to protect. Do you want me to continue to the next part? Medical records and the quiet science of justice. The trial may have concluded, but Hartford had not yet finished with the Petron affair. Justice in a court of law was only one layer. Beneath it lay something more technical, more enduring, the preservation of facts, the slow conversion of tragedy into case study. Dr. Nathaniel Harrison, already known for his calm testimony, was approached by the state's medical board to assemble a complete record of the incident. It would serve not only as an archive but as guidance, a precedent in an era where forensics still crouched like a timid child in the shadow of jurisprudence. The work began with Bridget herself. Though recovered enough to resume daily life, she remained a subject of medical fascination. Harrison, with the consent of both Bridget and William, documented each symptom as it had presented: the acrid metallic taste on her tongue, the burning along her throat, the sudden violent contractions of the stomach, the tremors, the pallor, the cold sweat. He noted the chronology down to the minute, as reconstructed from multiple witnesses. He compared these observations with existing literature, some from Britain, some from France, where arsenic had already begun its grim career as both pest control and weapon. The similarity was undeniable. In each confirmed poisoning case abroad, the early signs mirrored Bridget's precisely. This alone would later be cited in legal journals as proof of intentional administration, not of accidental contact or ambient contamination, but of direct ingestion. Then came the chalice. Its residue, carefully preserved in a glass vial sealed with wax, underwent repeated analysis. Harrison collaborated with a chemist named Elias Cotter, whose small laboratory smelled perpetually of sulfur and ink. Together they demonstrated, through simple but reliable precipitation tests, the presence of arsenic trioxide. The compound glittered faintly in its crystalline form, a beauty that mocked its purpose. What made their findings particularly valuable was not only the confirmation of poison, but the estimate of dose. By calculating the approximate concentration, Cotter deduced that the amount would have been fatal for a woman of Bridget's size, had intervention been delayed even an hour. The vomitive treatments administered in those frantic first moments likely prevented full absorption, buying time for her body's own defenses to rally. This too found its way into journals, evidence that rapid medical action could reverse even deliberate malice. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hale, the magistrate whose appetite for thoroughness bordered on compulsion, had not stopped digging. He petitioned for and received access to Eleanor's household inventories.
Among ledgers for food, coal and linen, one notation stood out: a discreet payment to a local apothecary for pest deterrent, urgent. The date aligned precisely with the procurement Cotter had earlier described. It was not conclusive in isolation, but in context it formed a chain of logic no sober mind could break. For Hartford's legal community, these converging threads, medical, chemical, documentary, marked a turning point. Up to that point, crimes of the domestic sphere often devolved into he-said, she-said disputes, resolved by character testimony more than evidence. But the Petron case showed that science, properly gathered and patiently interpreted, could pierce even the thick drapery of social privilege. In chambers and coffee houses, young lawyers debated whether such methods might one day become routine. Older practitioners grumbled that the dignity of the courts should not be sullied with laboratory curiosities. But even they could not ignore how swiftly and cleanly the Petron verdict had been reached compared with trials of equal complexity. And there were other implications, less technical, more human. Harrison, in the quiet of his study, began writing a treatise not on arsenic per se, but on bias as a vector of harm. He wrote with the tone of a man who had seen too clearly how prejudice, when distilled, behaves like poison, invisible, cumulative, devastating. "We treat ailments of the body with vigor," he wrote in one draft, "yet we allow social maladies to progress unchecked until they too claim lives. The chalice may be silver, but hatred is the draught." Privately, Bridget read these drafts. She said little but underlined passages with a faint pencil mark, pausing longest at one line near the margin. Mercy must never excuse danger, yet justice must never forget mercy. It was a balance she herself was beginning to navigate, how to live with the knowledge of an attempt on her life without letting that knowledge harden into vengeance. Meanwhile, Boston brought a reprieve of sorts. In its bustling streets, few recognized the couple. William found cases to argue, wills to draft, contracts to defend. He practiced law with a fervor that suggested penance, though he owed none. Bridget joined church committees, then boards of charitable trusts, slowly weaving herself into a civic fabric less brittle than Hartford's had been. She visited hospitals, distributed clothing, argued quietly but effectively for the fair treatment of Irish newcomers, never invoking her own history, but embodying its lessons. But in Hartford, echoes persisted. Father Matthews, still priest at Trinity, received letters from other clergymen across New England, seeking guidance on safeguarding sacraments. He replied with sober instructions, all variations on one theme: do not trust prestige over procedure. He described, without flourish, how even respected families may falter, and how a single lapse of oversight can turn ceremony into catastrophe. Legal scholars, too, began citing the case as a reference point. It appeared first in pamphlets, then in university lectures, eventually in a bound volume titled Selected American Criminal Proceedings, 1835. There, the Petron affair sat alongside counterfeiters, smugglers, and a notorious duel, distinct not for its violence but for its civility gone feral. Yet for those closest to it, the science, the precedent, even the public reproof meant little against the private wreckage. William, despite outward competence, carried a weight visible only in unguarded moments, the way his gaze drifted when others spoke of mothers, the way he stiffened at the scent of incense, as though the wedding day might in some cruel magic repeat itself. Bridget's body healed, but she knew it had been marked, not visibly, not in any way strangers would notice, but in that deep interior register where trust resides. Food, once a casual joy, became ritual. Cups were inspected without thought. Even the smallest indulgence, a sweet, a cordial, passed her lips only after her eyes had measured, her nose had tested. It was a habit neither William nor her children ever remarked upon, but one they quietly learned to mirror, as if safety could be inherited alongside sorrow. Back in Hartford, Eleanor's name still surfaced in whispers, never at table, but in carriage rides, in curtained parlors, in moments when conversation stumbled into the terrain of shame. Some insisted she had acted out of a mother's desperate love, others that she had merely unveiled what many respectable households felt, but dared not attempt. A few, particularly among newer families eager to cement their status, spoke of her as cautionary example, that one must never let disdain cloud judgment to the point of self-destruction. Meanwhile, the silver of the chalice, once sacred, then weaponized, now served immigrants Eleanor had feared, its transformation itself a quiet rebuke. In some households, this fact alone turned supper conversation somber. It suggested a moral arithmetic at work in the world, one that redistributed honor and disgrace not according to lineage but according to truth. And so Part 5 closes not with climax but with transition. The city, the family, even the disciplines of medicine and law had shifted, subtly but permanently. The poison was gone from Bridget's blood, yet something lingered, not chemical but cultural, a faint bitter awareness that civilization's surface is thinner than anyone dares admit. Returnings, reverberations, and the long shadow of a wedding. By 1853, 12 years after the trial that had transfixed Hartford, Eleanor Petton was released quietly from the Connecticut State Prison. The newspapers that had once printed her name in bold type now relegated the event to a single paragraph, buried between reports of harvest yields and shipping schedules. The city had moved on, or so it liked to believe. But cities remember in ways individuals cannot. They store shame like a scent clings to cloth, and when Eleanor walked once more down Main Street, stooped, dressed in plain grey, with a bonnet that concealed most of her face, shutters shifted. Not dramatically, not like in novels or melodramas, but with the subtle choreography of avoidance, eyes averted, greetings withheld, doors that had once opened now remained politely, firmly shut. She rented a room above a boarding house kept by a widow who prided herself on minding her own business. There, Eleanor wrote letters she never sent. She drafted apologies to William, entreaties to Bridget, even half-hearted justifications to anyone who might still care. But each page ended the same way, a slow, deliberate tearing, as if even paper should not carry the weight of what had been done. Meanwhile, in Boston, William and Bridget were raising 3 children in a house whose windows faced the sea. They had learned to let silence be their shield. The children knew vaguely that their grandmother had made mistakes, but the details were locked behind the gentle authority of parental discretion. Bridget carried her history with the grace of someone who had refused to be defined by it, even as it shaped her every choice. Charity work became her domain, and she moved within Boston's social circles not as a curiosity, but as a quiet force. When committees stalled over whether immigrant families deserved aid, Bridget would wait for the lull in argument and then speak, clear, reasonable, irrefutable. "We are judged not by who we welcome easily," she would say, "but by who we welcome despite our unease." No one mentioned Hartford, but its echo could be heard in every syllable. William's career thrived in parallel. His reputation for honesty, even when painful, became a hallmark that drew clients from both old families and new enterprises. He argued cases before judges, who respected his unwillingness to manipulate or evade. In private, he sometimes wondered whether he had built his practice as atonement, not for sins of his own, but for the weight of bloodlines and the corrosive ambitions of the dead. Back in Hartford, the Petton name endured like a house stripped of paint, still standing, still recognizable, but weathered beyond repair. A few cousins clung to the illusion of social immunity, hosting teas where guests pretended not to notice that the room felt half empty compared with years past. Younger society, hungrier for novelty than lineage, cared little for the shame except when using it to score conversational points. Of course, one remembers what happened at that wedding, don't they? Always with a knowing glance, a drop of voice, a performance of distance. By 1858, Eleanor's heart, weakened by years of poor diet and constant worry, finally surrendered. There was no grand funeral, only a modest service attended by a few church acquaintances, 2 servants who had once worked in her household, and a priest who spoke of repentance as if offering a threadbare cloak to a woman who had already stepped beyond weather. The obituary was respectful but brief, a polite punctuation to a sentence Hartford had been trying not to reread for nearly 2 decades. But history is a patient archivist. In 1865, when William returned to Hartford for the first time since the trial, he did so not alone, but with Bridget and their children, a living testament to survival not only of persons but of principles. They visited Jonathan Petton's grave first, laying flowers in silence, William's hand resting lightly on Bridget's shoulder. Then, in a decision unplanned but somehow inevitable, they walked to Trinity Church. The church had changed, its pews had been replaced, its windows repaired after a storm, its ceremonial practices now carried out under the strict oversight of multiple witnesses. Yet as Bridget stepped into the nave, a flicker of memory passed across her face, the scent of incense, the rustle of silk, the sudden searing pain that had begun her slow passage through death's vestibule. She did not falter, but her breath grew shallow until William's fingers curled gently around hers, a reminder that the past, though ineradicable, was not sovereign. Father Matthews, older now, recognized them instantly. He greeted them with a warmth that held no trace of pity. Over tea in the rectory, he spoke candidly of that day long past, not to reopen wounds, but to honor the unlikely arc of grace that had followed. "In my sermons now," he confessed, "I often tell young couples that marriages are not only private vows, but public acts of courage. Yours proved that in a way none of us could have anticipated." Bridget smiled faintly. "We did not feel brave at the time," she said. "We only felt alive and unwilling to let that be taken from us." The children, 2 sons, 1 daughter, asked questions in low voices.
Not all of them were answered, but enough were that they began to understand why their mother sometimes stared a beat too long at a glass of wine before drinking, why their father went quiet at the mention of grandmothers. Outside the church, an elderly woman approached. Her bonnet shaded her face, but her voice carried a timbre of recognition. "Mrs. Petton?" she asked tentatively. When Bridget nodded, the woman clasped her hands together. "I knew your husband's mother," she said. "I do not defend what she did, God knows, but I have always wished someone would tell you that she spoke often, in her last years, of regret so deep it frightened her. She did not write because she did not believe she deserved to intrude upon the life you had salvaged. I thought perhaps you might want to know." Bridget closed her eyes briefly, the way one closes them at the sudden smell of rain. When she opened them again, her expression was neither soft nor hard, but steady. "Thank you," she said simply. "That is enough." They returned to Boston the next day, their visit leaving no scandal, no whispered speculation, only a ripple of something quieter than forgiveness but adjacent to it, a recognition that the human story, even at its ugliest, resists clean erasure. In the years that followed, the poisoned chalice case, as the newspapers had once dubbed it, became less of a gossip piece and more of a jurisprudential landmark. Law students debated its precedent-setting integration of chemical evidence. Medical colleges cited Dr. Harrison's documentation as an early example of methodical toxicology in American courts. Even civic leaders referenced it when arguing for more equitable treatment of immigrants, pointing to how prejudice left unchecked could corrode even the most seemingly stable families. By the time the century turned, Hartford had grown, changed, modernized. Electric lights replaced gas lamps. Horse-drawn carriages gave way to streetcars. The Petton scandal was no longer a living memory, but a historical footnote, the kind one might stumble upon in a brittle-bound volume in a library's quiet corner. And yet, whenever a wedding party lifted glasses in Trinity Church, someone, an usher, a cantor, perhaps even the priest, would, just for an instant, glance toward the chalice. Not in fear, not even in conscious recollection, but in the reflexive caution of a city that had once learned, in the harshest possible way, how easily joy can be poisoned. The story returns to the living. By the autumn of 1873, a generation had passed since a chalice at Trinity Church carried both sacrament and poison. Hartford had become almost unrecognizable to anyone who had lived through those tense weeks in 1840. Factories belched smoke on the outskirts, telegraph wires hung like metal vines along newly widened streets, and families whose names once held weight found themselves competing with brash industrialists who neither knew nor cared about pedigrees that reached back to colonial days. And yet, the human tendency to retell dark stories remained unchanged. A young law clerk, combing through court archives for precedents in an inheritance dispute, stumbled across the trial transcript of Eleanor Petton. The language was stiff with 19th-century decorum, but the facts throbbed like a fresh wound. Poison in a chalice, a bride nearly dead, a mother-in-law condemned. The clerk couldn't resist recounting the case at a dinner table that evening. Within weeks, Hartford's newspapers, now more eager than ever for lurid human interest, published a retrospective piece under the headline, "A Crime of Society and Sacrament, 32 Years Ago." The article, heavy with moral instruction, nonetheless carried the faint spice of entertainment. It quoted courtroom dialogue, painted Eleanor as both villain and victim, and praised Bridget's grace under mortal peril. Boston papers reprinted the story, then New York's, until one morning, William unfolded the Boston Advertiser to find his mother's name, his wife's agony, and his own youthful grief, arranged like an opera libretto on page 3. Bridget read the article only once. She folded the paper neatly, returned it to the breakfast table and said, "They have taken a tragedy and turned it into a curiosity. It was bound to happen." William felt an old heat rise in him, protective, indignant, helpless. "It should not happen," he muttered, but the words lacked force. He was a lawyer. He knew that once a story left private lips for public print, it belonged less to the people who lived it than to the culture eager to consume it. For their children, now adults, the sudden resurgence of the past was disorienting. They had been raised on gentler versions of events, half-truths meant to keep pain at bay. Now strangers approached them at concerts or in railway stations, murmuring awkward sympathies, asking whether it had really been arsenic, whether the priest had fainted, whether forgiveness had ever passed between mother and son. The eldest Jonathan bristled. "We owe no one an accounting," he snapped one evening after a dinner guest tiptoed around the subject until Bridget, with her characteristic courtesy, offered a few spare details to quiet the curiosity. But the youngest Margaret surprised everyone. "If they will speak of it," she said, "let them speak of it accurately. Perhaps the lesson does some good if it's told without invention." She suggested that the family, rather than hiding from the retellings, shape them. Thus, a curious project began. William gathered surviving letters, court summaries, and parish notes. Bridget contributed her own brief recollections, carefully free of melodrama. Together, they assembled a sober, factual account of the wedding, the poisoning, the trial, and the years of repair that followed. It was published in a modest run, titled simply An Account of the Piton Affair of 1841, a statement for the record. No profits were sought. Copies were donated to libraries, to law schools, to historical societies. The aim was not fame but control, to wrest the story from gossip's grasp and return it, however belatedly, to the dignity of truth. In Hartford, the response was mixed. Some welcomed the clarity, others found it tasteless to reopen wounds long since scabbed. But among students of law and medicine, the booklet became unexpectedly influential. Professors used it to illustrate the convergence of prejudice, forensic evidence, and social status in 19th-century jurisprudence. Medical lecturers cited Dr. Harrison's meticulous testimony as an early model of scientific rigor. And then, quietly, something shifted in the civic imagination. What had once been whispered with scandal now began to be cited with instruction, a case study not only of crime, but of what could happen when fear of social decline metastasized into violence. By the 1880s, Hartford had monuments to industrial benefactors, to soldiers, to politicians, but among the city's quiet changes was one that never earned a plaque. Irish immigrants, once treated as a suspect class, now sat on councils, ran businesses, presided over church committees. The poisonous logic that had driven Eleanor to her desperate act had not vanished. Prejudice rarely dies, but it had been wounded, publicly, irreversibly, by the very crime it produced. Bridget aged into a matron revered in 2 cities. In Boston, she continued her charitable work, expanding from immigrant relief to education for poor women. In Hartford, she was spoken of with a strange mixture of distance and gratitude, as though her survival had forced the city to face itself in a mirror. William outlived her by 4 years. In his final months, confined mostly to a chair by the window, he read often from the booklet they had prepared together decades earlier. He traced the careful lines of ink with a fingertip, pausing occasionally, as if listening for the echo of voices he had loved and lost. When he died, the Boston Daily Advertiser gave him a full-column obituary, praising not only his legal career, but also his moral constancy in the face of personal calamity. The next generation carried the name Piton without stigma. Indeed, by the turn of the century, few associated it with anything beyond competence and civic contribution. But in archives, in the minds of scholars, in the corridors of law schools, the story continued to breathe, less as gossip now, more as parable, and still a trace of unease lingered in Trinity Church. Caretakers said it was nonsense, but acolytes whispered of it all the same, that sometimes, when the chalice was lifted in the candlelit hush of an evening wedding, a faint metallic bitterness undetectable in the wine itself seemed to cling to the rim, as if memory could seep into metal. No harm ever followed, no illness ever traced, yet the quiet instinct remained to glance, fleetingly, at the faces of bride, groom, and guests whenever the cup passed from hand to hand. Whether that sensation was imagination, suggestion, or some strange chemistry of place and time, no one could prove. But in Hartford, where history and myth often braided like threads in the same cloth, few dismissed it entirely, and perhaps that was the truest legacy of the poisoned wedding. Not the trial, not the textbooks, not even the civic reforms, but the enduring reminder that beneath the rituals we trust lie fragile human hearts, capable of both astonishing loyalty and ruinous fear. A reminder to look carefully at the cup, at the hand that offers it, at the stories we tell ourselves about who deserves to belong, and to ask, before it is too late, whether we have let prejudice write the next act of our lives.
The return of memory, the weight of truth. It was in 1891, 50 years after the chalice at Trinity carried its bitter cargo, that Hartford once again found itself speaking the Piton name aloud in rooms where it had been carefully avoided for decades. The city had changed again. Gaslight giving way to electricity, the city hall now a stone fortress of municipal ambition, newspapers fatter, hungrier, more brazen. A professor at Yale, a man enamored of the young science of psychiatry, delivered a public lecture in Hartford on the interplay of social ambition, familial devotion, and psychopathology. His central case study, the Piton affair. He spoke with clinical detachment, but the words had a way of bending back toward the human. He described Eleanor not merely as a criminal but as a mind eroded by fear of social decline, a woman whose moral architecture had collapsed beneath cultural pressure and private grief. Reporters attended. They sharpened his lecture into headlines, stripped of nuance but heavy with implication: madness in the parlors of Hartford, when motherhood turns to murder. By morning, the city hummed with it again. Shops, boarding houses, trolley stops. The name Piton left lips like an incantation. People who had been children in 1841 suddenly remembered overheard whispers, small gestures, faces in mourning clothes. A few claimed dreams they'd had at the time now seemed prophetic. It was not history alone now, it was memory called up, restless and aching. The Petton descendants had by then scattered across New England. Some were merchants, some lawyers, a few teachers, and one, Eleanor's great-granddaughter Anne, a quiet nurse in a Hartford hospital, living under her married name to avoid the soft but persistent curiosity that followed the old surname. Anne read the newspaper that week in the dim morning light of a ward still half asleep. The article carried a photograph of Trinity's altar, gleaming and dignified, with a caption that declared, "The chalice once bearing death, now bearing only grace." Her hands trembled just slightly, though no one noticed. She folded the paper and tucked it beneath a ledger, but the words clung to her like static. That evening after her shift, she walked to Trinity. The building smelled of beeswax and stone, the cool air inside both soothing and severe. She sat in a rear pew, her gloves folded in her lap, eyes fixed not on the altar but on the floorboards beneath it, as though the memory of a woman she had never met might be leaking upward through wood and time. Father Lewis, a gentle man with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, found her there. "You've come for quiet," he said softly. "I've come for a name," Anne replied, surprising even herself. He sat beside her, neither of them speaking for a long while. Finally she said, "They have turned it into lecture and legend, but no one remembers she was a person. No one says she laughed, or grieved, or believed she was right, even while doing what was wrong." Father Lewis nodded. "Sin does not erase humanity. It stains it, distorts it, but it leaves behind a person, still a person." Anne looked up then, her face pale but steady. "I carry her blood. Does it carry her fear with it? Her pride, her cruelty, or only her sorrow?" The priest, to his credit, did not rush into easy theology. He considered, then said, "Blood carries many things, none more strongly than possibility. You cannot inherit her crime, only the warning she left behind." Outside, dusk bled into the narrow streets, and somewhere a carriage wheel snapped against a stone, loud and sharp like the crack of a pistol. Anne flinched, then rose, thanking Father Lewis, leaving quietly as though not to disturb the ghosts. But ghosts, as Hartford had learned, did not always wait for permission. That same week, a group of amateur historians petitioned the city to mark the Petton case with a small brass plaque near Trinity. For educational purposes, they insisted, not morbid curiosity. The parish council debated furiously. Some argued it would dignify the tragedy by acknowledging it, others feared it would turn sacred ground into a spectacle. The vote failed by a single ballot. The plaque was never made, but the discussion leaked to the press, and suddenly people were standing outside the church in the evenings, pointing, whispering, daring each other to step closer. Children played at poisoned wedding the way earlier generations had played at pirates or highwaymen, and slowly, something darker began to drift beneath the city's chatter. Caretakers spoke of a faint taste, not every night, not every service, but sometimes, when the chalice was polished and prepared, a hint of bitterness at the tongue, as if metal could hold memory the way wood holds smoke. A young deacon fainted during a wedding rehearsal, swearing afterward that the cup had turned cold in his hands, cold as river water in March. The physician declared exhaustion, but the deacon, pale and shaking, refused ever to serve a wedding again. Nothing dangerous followed. No illness, no sudden deaths, no patterns of tragedy. But the stories compounded, each whispered with a little more certainty than the last, until an invisible aura hung about the chalice, not cursed exactly, but heavy, as though the act it once held had not been entirely rinsed away. By 1900, the affair was no longer a mere case in the city's legal memory. It was a mirror. It showed Hartford its own history of cruelty disguised as propriety, ambition masquerading as virtue. It showed how fear of social decline could become a toxin more potent than arsenic. And it showed, painfully, how even acts meant to preserve a family could nearly destroy it. Anne lived to see her children grow up in a city that no longer whispered her family name with scandal, but with caution, with the weight of history carried like a bruise you cannot quite forget. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, she would sit at her writing desk and begin a letter she never finished, to whoever remembers, trying to explain that families are not their worst act, nor are they entirely innocent of it. That we inherit not guilt, but the shape of choices once made, and the responsibility to unmake them in our own time. The letters were never sent. She kept them folded in a drawer, tied with a blue ribbon. They would be found decades later by a grandson studying law, who would read them with the quiet reverence one reserves for a candle in a long corridor. And thus the story moved again, not loudly this time, not in courtrooms or newspapers, but in the private circulation of memory, humility, and a caution that ran deeper than scandal.
The chalice remained at Trinity, still in use, gleaming, ordinary, its history tucked away in footnotes and whispered warnings. And every so often a priest lifting it at the height of the ceremony would pause, almost imperceptibly, as though feeling in the weight of silver and wine, the full measure of what human hands are capable of, for good and for harm, the quiet echo of a crime. By the second decade of the 20th century, the Peton affair had become less a scandal than a shadow, thin, persistent, and capable of unsettling even those who had never read the original case. Professors still used it as an example of jurisprudence, priests still mentioned it in homilies about forgiveness and pride. But in parlors and drawing rooms, in trolley cars and lecture halls, the name was spoken now with a kind of wistful caution. The poison had faded, but the warning had not. A generation that had never seen Hartford without electric light had inherited a city different in every visible way. Skyscrapers inched up where horse barns had stood. Streetcars clanged past polished banks. Yet, as with all cities, the new stood atop layers of old soil, and sometimes the old reached upward like roots, tugging at the living. In 1914, as Europe slid toward war, a young seminarian named Thomas Greer was assigned to Trinity Church. He was bright, ambitious, given to long hours of reading theology by candlelight, even when electric lamps sat idle on his desk. He had, until that autumn, never heard of the Peton name. One evening, searching for an old missal in the church's dusty archive, he found a leather folder tied with twine. Inside lay letters, brittle with age, written in the looping hand of the mid-19th century. The first lines chilled him. To whomever holds this in trust, the act committed in this house of God was mine and mine alone. I write not to plead for forgiveness, but to leave no doubt that my sin was both deliberate and preventable. The signature was unmistakable, Eleanor Peton. The letters were a confession, composed during her imprisonment. They spoke of fear, of losing her family's station, of seeing her son entwined with a world she did not trust, of believing with tragic certainty that social decay was a fate worse than death. She wrote of her own reasoning with a clarity that startled Thomas. There was no madness in the words, only a terrible, ordinary logic carried to a monstrous conclusion. He read every letter twice, then a third time. He placed them back in the folder, locked it in the archive cabinet, and sat for a long while in the pews, staring at the altar. When he finally told Father Lewis, the older priest listened silently, then said, "It is the truth we already know, but truth written in the hand of the one who sinned weighs differently." The parish council debated whether to release the letters to historians. Ultimately, they decided against it, fearing that fresh publicity would cheapen what had long since become a solemn caution. The folder was sealed, but not destroyed, and so the record of Eleanor's own words sat waiting, a confession folded inside a church that had never quite stopped humming with her name. Meanwhile, outside the quiet vaults of Trinity, the city pressed forward. Immigrants from Italy, Poland and beyond filled the streets with new languages, new smells, new tensions. The same cycle, fear of newcomers, suspicion of intermarriage, anxious preservation of old status, repeated itself in subtle ways. The Peton story, when mentioned, felt less like ancient history and more like a mirror, hastily covered with a cloth. Thomas carried the weight of the letters with him into every wedding he served. He found himself lingering at the chalice, not out of superstition, but out of a quiet, gnawing recognition that the object which once bore grace had borne death, and that no ritual, however sacred, could entirely cleanse the memory.
In 1925, an anniversary mass for the parish drew an unusually large crowd. The chalice, polished to a mirror sheen, caught the evening light in sharp flashes as it passed from hand to hand. An elderly parishioner, one who claimed to have heard stories from her grandmother about the poisoned bride, leaned to her neighbor and whispered, "Do you taste it? That strange metallic sting, like pennies on the tongue." Her neighbor laughed nervously, but later, walking home, found himself licking at his teeth, trying to rid himself of the imagined flavor. No one fell ill, no accidents followed. Yet by the next week, the whisper had returned. The chalice carried a trace, not of arsenic, but of history itself, a reminder that the sacred was never safe from human hands. The story reached newspapers again in 1933, this time in a Sunday feature column about Hartford's forgotten crimes. The tone was half sympathetic, half sensational, filled with sepia photographs of Trinity's steeple and courtroom sketches pulled from archives. But nestled between the familiar facts was a detail that drew unexpected attention, a short note about letters discovered decades earlier, written by Eleanor herself, now sealed by the parish. Speculation erupted. What did the letters say? Were there accomplices? Was there remorse? Did they contain accusations? Father Lewis had long since passed away, but Thomas, now himself the parish priest, issued a brief statement. The letters contain nothing unknown to history, only the personal weight of a confession. Out of respect for the families involved, they will remain in the church's care. The decision was not universally accepted. Amateur historians demanded access. Tabloids hinted at cover-ups. For a brief, strange season, Hartford found itself once more orbiting a crime whose flesh had long rotted, but whose bones still rattled when shaken. And then, as always, the city's attention shifted. The Great Depression deepened, new scandals emerged, wars began and ended. But in quiet corners, in archives, in whispered family lore, in the cool, still sanctuary of Trinity Church, the Peton affair persisted like a faint pulse in an old body. By mid-century, only scholars and clergy spoke of it with any seriousness. Yet the chalice remained. Weddings still passed it from hand to hand, and every now and then a bride or groom would glance at the cup, hesitate a fraction of a second longer than etiquette required, and then drink, the act both an affirmation of faith and an unconscious nod to a story whose echo had not quite faded. The last toast. By the early 1960s, Hartford had changed beyond recognition. Glass towers replaced brownstone homes, neon buzzed where gaslight once flickered, and yet Trinity Church stood exactly where it had always stood, brick, stone, and memory. The city's modern roar seemed to roll right past its heavy doors as if unwilling to disturb the silence inside. It was a May afternoon in 1963 when historian Clara Whitaker first arrived at Trinity, chasing the faintest trail of the Peton scandal. She was young, sharp-eyed, with a knack for drawing stories out of archives like bones out of the earth. Her professor had dismissed the topic. Too provincial. The Irish question's been done to death. Besides, you'll never get the church to talk. Clara smiled when he said that. Challenge was fuel. In the parish office she found Father O'Neill, a tall, soft-spoken man with a face carved by decades of parish funerals and baptisms. When she asked about Eleanor Peton, he didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at her for a long time, weighing her not as a threat, but as someone who might finally be worthy of the weight in the locked cabinet. "I've read the trial transcripts," Clara said, "but there are pieces missing. The tone doesn't match the facts. Either the court dramatized her confession, or she left something unsaid. My hunch is the latter." Father O'Neill turned toward the cabinet. The key on his ring trembled as if from some muscle memory of caution. He hesitated. "The letters," Clara whispered. The priest nodded. Within the hour, Clara sat at a wooden table in the rectory, sunlight cutting through the dust in solid golden beams. Before her lay the sealed leather folder Thomas Greer had locked away half a century earlier. She opened it carefully. The first letter was exactly what the newspapers had hinted, a clear confession, unemotional yet devastating, but the latter pages startled her. Eleanor had not merely confessed, she had chronicled the weeks leading to the wedding in chilling, meticulous detail. There were names, conversations, servants bribed for silence, the chemical supplier who sold her the arsenic under the guise of pest control, a respected man who went on to become a city councillor, a cousin who had advised her not to act rashly but never reported the threat. Eleanor wrote their names not in revenge, but in what she called a ledger of complicity, so that history may see clearly what courts could not. Clara looked up from the brittle pages, her throat dry. "Father, this isn't just her crime," she said softly. "This is Hartford's crime." Father O'Neill folded his hands, his expression unreadable. "And now you understand why we have guarded it," he replied. "Not to shield her, but to shield the living from the corruption of the dead." Clara sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the bells tolled the hour. Inside, the weight of a century pressed down like a cathedral stone. In the weeks that followed, Clara wrestled with a decision. To publish the letters would bring academic glory, proof that prejudice in Hartford had not only permitted, but quietly encouraged a murder attempt. It would also tear open family names still woven into the city's legal, political, and philanthropic circles. To keep them sealed would mean surrendering a truth she had fought to find. She chose a narrow path. Clara published her research, meticulously footnoted, devastating in its restraint, but she omitted the names that Eleanor had listed, referring to them only as respected figures, whose descendants remain in Hartford to this day. The academic world buzzed, Hartford's elite seethed in private, the church remained silent, but something strange happened next. Far from scandalizing the city, Clara's work revived a quiet pride, not in Eleanor, but in Bridget. The poisoned bride became a symbol of survival, of dignity under siege, of the immigrant strength that had once been sneered at and now stood at the very heart of Hartford's civic identity. By the 1980s, the city held an annual historical lecture on the case, hosted in the very courthouse where Eleanor had been sentenced. Irish and Yankee descendants sat side by side, listening not for guilt but for lessons. The chalice, no longer used for weddings, sat in a glass case at Trinity, polished to a mirror finish, a placard beneath it reading, "Once the instrument of harm, now a vessel of warning. Let no heart become so hardened that it mistakes cruelty for protection." Visitors would linger there, staring at the cup, imagining the cold weight of it in trembling hands. Some swore they felt a chill radiating from the metal.
A few claimed quietly that the chalice carried a curse, that any who touched it with pride or prejudice in their heart would taste metal for days, as though the city itself were warning them not to repeat its sins. Whether curse or conscience, the effect endured. Hartford's social walls softened. Intermarriage, once scandalous, became ordinary. The descendants of families who had whispered against Bridget's bloodline now toasted grandchildren who carried it proudly, and yet, every so often, a young couple standing before Trinity's altar would glance at that glass case, and a flicker of unease would pass between them. The story was too vivid, too human, to ever be safely tucked away. The mother-in-law who poisoned the bride was no longer a villain from some distant age. She was a warning that love can rot when fear and status outweigh compassion. In the end, Eleanor's crime achieved the opposite of her intention. The union she tried to sever became a lineage that thrived. The prejudice she thought eternal was exposed as fragile. The reputation she killed to protect became the cautionary tale attached to her name, and the chalice, the simple shining cup, remains.